Howdy folks, hope you all had a good weekend and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. A highly unusual episode of Mingles with Jingles this week because I actually remembered to write down all of the stuff, or at least most of the stuff, well, some of the stuff that I thought about during the week that I thought might be interesting to talk about in Mingles. And one of the things that I thought might be interesting to talk about was the fact that aircraft carriers have just made their appearance in the console version of World of Warships Legends. And people don't actually hate them, because it turns out that in World of Warships Legends, your anti-aircraft guns actually work. Now I don't know why this is. I don't know if it's just because the World of Warships Legends developers have thought it might be a good idea for ships that were designed specifically to shoot down aircraft and provide AA support for an entire battle fleet should actually be quite good at shooting down aircraft. Something which you can clearly see that the PC developers think is just crazy talk if you look, for example, at ships that were specifically designed to shoot down aircraft, like the Atlanta, for example. It could be that in World of Warships Legends, anti-aircraft guns actually start the battle loaded. That's not a joke, by the way. I know it sounds like one, but in World of Warships PC, your anti-aircraft guns start the battle unloaded. I don't know if you were aware of this. Your AA gunners don't actually load their guns and start shooting at enemy aircraft until those enemy aircraft have actually penetrated the outer ring of the range of the long-range anti-aircraft guns. You know, at the beginning of the battle, when the countdown ends and you can finally control your ship and you hear battle stations or action starts or whatever, that only applies to everybody on the ship apart from the anti-aircraft gun crews. While everybody else is running around frantically bringing the ship to general quarters or action stations, are all still sitting around smoking cigarettes, drinking tea and playing cards. They don't actually leap into action until it's too late. What do you mean too late? Well, consider how quickly aircraft travel, and consider the rate of fire of these anti-aircraft guns. Let's say your long-range AA gun, which in, for example, a ship like the Atlanta, consists of the 5-inch dual-purpose gun batteries. And these guns have a reload of, I don't know, I can't be bothered to look it up, let's say 4 or 5 seconds. Which means the gun crews don't leap into action until enemy aircraft actually enter the range of these 5-inch guns. And then they start loading them, which takes 4 or 5 seconds. And then they start firing them at aircraft that are approaching at speeds of anything between 150 to more than 200 knots. So just exactly how long do you think these aircraft are going to stay inside the firing range of these long-range anti-aircraft guns? The situation's made even more comical when you have aircraft carriers that have particularly fast and stealthy aircraft that don't even get spotted until they're halfway inside the maximum range of the long-range AA guns, at which point, by the time the guns are loaded, it's already too late. So is it any wonder that anti-aircraft fire is so comically and hilariously ineffective in World of Warships PC? But when you point out to the developers the sheer absurdity of having anti-aircraft gunners just sitting around reading comics while the rest of the ship is at action stations around them, they insist, it'll be fine. Meanwhile, over on console, it's exactly the opposite. And in fact, the new carrier players on console are complaining that the best way to get any damage done in a console aircraft carrier are to use the carrier itself as a torpedo and ram somebody. And I think that's fine. Perhaps I'm going slightly too far in the other direction, but I've had to put up with carriers on PC for 2 years, so you can probably understand why. While we're on the subject of carriers, and I'm not talking about aircraft carriers now, we're talking about fleet carriers in Elite Dangerous. It came to my attention during the course of perusing various different news forums last week that fleet carrier captains in Elite Dangerous, not all of them obviously, but some fleet carrier captains in Elite Dangerous have been taking part in the ancient trade of slavery. And I'm not here talking about the perfectly legal, in certain parts of the Empire, trade in slaves. I'm talking about kidnapping and enslaving actual players. Now, I admit I'm not in possession of all of the facts here. I haven't had an awful lot of time to investigate what's been going on, but it seems that this brand new trade in enslaved player characters began completely by accident. Or at least the idea for it may have begun as something quite innocent, because it's not particularly common, but also not completely unusual, to find that at the end of a long mining session, there aren't actually any orbitals or space stations present in the system in which you've been mining, but there are usually quite a few player-controlled fleet carriers. So at the end of these long mining sessions, players would often dock with and log off on one of these fleet carriers. But the primary difference between a fleet carrier and an orbital, other than the fact that fleet carriers are owned and operated by players, is that orbitals don't move, and fleet carriers do. So it wasn't unusual for people to log back on the following day after their mining session to find that the fleet carrier had moved hundreds, perhaps even thousands of light years away from wherever it was that you'd expected to find yourself when you logged back on the next day. Now, if you're a professional miner, an elite with hundreds of millions of credits in your bank account, and an extremely expensive ship set up for mining, this is annoying, but it's not the end of the world, because the kind of ship that you're probably using will have spare module capacity for things like fuel scoops and large fuel tanks. So getting yourself back to civilization from the arse end of wherever it is that you currently find yourself after you've logged back in on board the fleet carrier that morning is really just a question of time and annoyance. It's not really a deal breaker. On the other hand, if you're just starting off in mining and you have a smaller and less expensive ship that once you've set it up for mining has no spare module capacity for anything else, this can be a bit of a problem, because you will often find yourself effectively stuck wherever it is the fleet carrier has taken you. It's important to note that when this sort of thing happened in the past, it was rarely, if ever, down to any kind of malicious intent on the part of the owner and operator of the fleet carrier that had stranded those players, and often, when it was brought to their attention, they would simply fly back to somewhere that the stranded player was capable of making their way home from. But it's safe to say that the genesis of the idea soon took root in the minds of, shall we say, some of the more unscrupulous members of the Elite player community. So when I heard about the scam that was happening in Elite, I investigated and I found an article on Polygon.com that explained in great detail exactly what it is that certain of the more unscrupulous members of the fleet carrier community in Elite have been getting up to. The story starts with a man named Jason. He's been playing games in the Elite franchise since 1984, and now he's sharing the experience with his children. His youngest son is 7, and even though the game is rated for older players, Jason makes sure that his littlest commander always plays with supervision. On the 29th of January this year, that supervisor was his 10-year-old sister. Someone approaches them in-game, Jason says, flies up alongside them and starts talking in on-game chat. I like to think I've ingrained some degree of online safety smarts, so my daughter took over, left the system, and calls for me. She talks me through the encounter and what had been said. Turns out the rumours I've been hearing elsewhere were true. Jason's kids had received a rather lucrative proposition. They were encouraged to fly to a fleet carrier, a mobile player-owned base, and exchange some simple goods for a large amount of in-game currency. Once the money had changed hands, a group of players would help them build a new starship, fly them to a mining claim, and help them break apart asteroids. The goal was to work together in order to farm void opals, one of the rarest and most expensive commodities in the game. The offer sounded too good to be true, and the girl's stranger danger instincts kicked in. If his older sister hadn't intervened, Jason's son would have been forced to sell those void opals for far less than their fair market value. Other players would then export those commodities to another system, profiting from his work. Making matters worse, Jason's son would have been trapped in that mining system, stranded more than 800 light years from the centre of the in-game galaxy. There would have been no way back other than to self-destruct his new starship and effectively begin Elite's grind all over again. Jason's son had been saved from this fate by the intervention of his 10-year-old sister. Many others would not be so lucky. The perpetrators were deliberately hanging around in star systems heavily populated by new players, many of them brought into the game by a free giveaway on the Epic Games Store in November. They said they were looking for recruits and offered to give these players money to buy a better ship, but also training them in how to farm void opals and a free ride to a good spot in which to find them. Behind the scenes, they were exploiting in-game systems to isolate these new commanders from everyone else in the game. First, they required new recruits to join a private instance of Elite called a player group. Playing in a PG is a good way to make sure you can meet up with your friends and allies, but it also cuts you off from ever seeing anyone else. Contributing to that isolation was the fact that this all happened on Xbox One, which has a much smaller player population than the PC version of the game. Travel in Elite is accomplished by folding space and jumping between star systems using a neighbouring star cluster as a kind of beacon. Once in the player group, players were instructed to outfit a new starship in a particular way that limited its range to less than 2 light years. As a consequence, they were completely unable to travel to another star system without the help of the fleet carrier. Once docked at the carrier and on board their custom-built mining rigs, recruits were ferried 800 light years away from the heart of the Milky Way and left to rot. Their only gameplay options? Mine void opals and sell them back to the carrier that brought them in for roughly 1/6 of the fair market price, or self-destruct. Now, upon hearing this news, your reaction to this story is likely to range anywhere between "oh my god, that's absolutely terrible" to "oh my god, that's absolutely hilarious." And if you've ever spent any length of time playing something like EVE Online, I'll bet good money that you're currently thinking, "oh my god, that's absolutely hilarious," because, well, EVE is kind of infamous for this sort of thing. I don't want to go so far as to say that coming up with new and interesting ways to screw over your fellow players is something that's actively encouraged in EVE Online, even though it kind of is, but it's definitely not penalised. The game's developers, CCP Games, have set up the universe, they've implemented the systems that make everything work, and then they sit back and they just let the players alone to get on with it. EVE is notorious for stories of lone, treacherous individuals who have brought entire alliances of tens or even hundreds of thousands of players to their knees thanks to their treachery and sneakiness. And the game's developers generally, as a rule of thumb, do not involve themselves in disputes or conflict between players. They sit back and they let the market balance itself effectively. And that's one of the major reasons for EVE's success. Not so much in Elite Dangerous, where the developers definitely do not have a reputation of sitting on their hands and just letting matters resolve themselves. But in this case, that appears to be more or less exactly what's happening. One brave player commander who'd been forced into slavery by this unscrupulous gang of fleet carrier operators tried to get some help. He called on the Fuel Rats. Now, the Fuel Rats is a player-operated organisation in Elite, and they're a great bunch who dedicate themselves to rescuing players who've stranded themselves after running out of fuel, wherever they may be in the galaxy. They recently celebrated their 100,000th rescue, something that was actually celebrated in-game by the game developers as part of a special event. So that day, when the Fuel Rat dispatcher in charge received the message, "Do the Fuel Rats rescue pilots who are trapped in concentration camps?" He was more than a little confused. The dispatcher assumed that the player was referring to an in-game mechanism that puts misbehaving players in jail, sending them to a penitentiary ship for high crimes and misdemeanors against AI-controlled ships. But it very quickly became apparent that something a lot more sinister was going on. The thing is, the Fuel Rats don't actually offer a service whereby they save people from forced labour camps. So the Fuel Rats called in the Specialists, another player group known as the Hull Seals. This is a newly formed group that performs high-risk repairs and other oddball rescues. A player in the Fuel Rats named Commander Led was among the first to start organising a rescue. Another commander, who goes by the name of Commander Medamus, was put in command of that effort, and using various Hull Seal assets, including multiple fleet carriers of their own, mounted a rescue operation. After several weeks of work, around a dozen newbie commanders have been pulled out and brought to safety. They tell Polygon that they think as many as 15 more players are still trapped, although bizarrely at least some may actually be willing participants. Polygon actually spoke to some of the perpetrators. It went about as well as you might expect. when confronting them with the fact that, in the case of Jason's 7-year-old son, they may, if not for the actions of his 10-year-old sister, have ended up entrapping a minor, he was immediately booted from their Discord server. But the guy in charge eventually got in touch with Polygon and had this to say. It was really just for the giggles. In reality, anyone could self-destruct and find their way back. And the fleet carrier traffic we produced before anyone else got involved would also allow for anyone to hitch a ride to and fro, which some players did. They said calling those commanders caught up in the scheme trapped was overstating it. It was just a very aggressive recruitment effort. Polygon asked for numbers on how many other players were involved, but they refused to share that information. Polygon then asked them if they would keep on doing it, and that's when their tone shifted. They said, and I quote, "Considering the cat's out of the bag and people will now try to mimic my method, yes. Not only will I keep doing it, I'm going to step it up a notch. I'm going to recruit harder than ever before. I, along with my cohorts, are going to build the greatest noob army this game has ever seen. We will truly be able to shape the galaxy with our wealth and influence. All this publicity has thrown us into a frenzy, and we will not go into private play, like some are saying. We're going to do it in the open, so all can witness the glory." The game developers, Frontier Developments, are in contact with the new Pilots Initiative about their rescue efforts. Even now, other player groups are coming together to launch rescue missions on their own on Xbox One. At least one fleet carrier has been positioned in system, following in the wake of the perpetrator's own ships. They've been set up to sell the parts needed to escape the Gulag at a fair price. Reached a comment, Frontier's Public Relations and Communications Manager said his team is monitoring the situation closely. So what do you think? Because I was quite surprised that Frontier Developments hadn't stepped in and done something about it. But I was even more surprised that it turns out they don't really need to. Now, does this mean that Elite is going to be following the EVE model and just letting players get on with policing themselves? I don't know. But I don't think it would be a bad thing if they did. Because that's always been EVE Online's greatest strength. All of the greatest things that have ever happened in EVE Online, of which there have been many, have all been as a direct result of players sorting things out amongst themselves, without any interference from the game developers. Emergent gameplay. Players coming together to take care of problems created by and perpetrated by other players, without any need for the developers to step in. Remember in the closing quote from the article on Polygon, Frontier Development's Public Relations and Communications Manager said his team was monitoring the situation closely. Yeah, I'll bet they are. I'll bet they're all sitting there thinking, this is amazing, don't touch it, just wait and see what happens. Or at least I hope they are. And I suspect they probably are, because they haven't done anything yet. Which hopefully means that they are instead just sitting there and watching the situation and taking down notes on how they can use this sort of thing to make the game better. Anyway, complete change of topic. I've got a question. Is it just me? Or are there suddenly at least twice as many adverts being run on YouTube videos than there were up until very recently? Because, well, I don't know about you lot, but I don't actually watch that much YouTube during the day. I've got far too many other things to do. But I watch a lot of YouTube at night. I go to bed, I take my phone, I fire up the YouTube app, and I just watch a whole bunch of videos until I fall asleep. And I have begun noticing that I'm starting to see one unskippable advert right at the start of every video that I watch, followed by another skippable advert. And then there are multiple advert breaks in the videos. And we're talking like every 2 or 3 minutes. It's not unusual to see 5 ad breaks in a 10-minute video. And then of course there's an advert at the end as well. Now I don't run mid-roll ads because they're a massive fucking pain in the arse. And it makes watching videos on YouTube almost unwatchable. And that's probably costing me a shit ton of money. Well, there's no probably about it. That is going to be costing me a shit ton of money. But I like people to enjoy the videos that I put up. So mid-roll ads are disabled on my 2 channels. And you shouldn't be seeing adverts on Mingles with Jingles at all, because I don't monetize this video as a thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. Although you may be seeing adverts on Mingles with Jingles, regardless of anything I have to say or do about it, because, well, a couple of months back, YouTube updated their terms of service, to give themselves permission to run adverts, even on videos that had been demonetized, like Mingles with Jingles, or on videos that they themselves had decided were not actually suitable for advertising. Or to put it another way, if your video is even slightly edgy or controversial, like a lot of my recent cyberpunk videos for example, YouTube don't allow me to make any money out of it, but they reserve the right to make money out of it themselves. Now, I'm sure it's a complete coincidence that amongst all of the plethora of adverts that I'm suddenly starting to see on videos that I watch on YouTube, and which are making the majority of these videos incredibly annoying to watch, many of these new ads, perhaps as many as 25%, are ads that are being run by YouTube themselves for YouTube Premium, the YouTube service that allows you to watch videos on YouTube without being bothered by all of those pesky adverts. I'm certain this is a complete coincidence and there's no connection whatsoever between these two facts, because of course YouTube and their parent company Google are a completely fine and upstanding company that have no track record whatsoever of trying to manipulate the market and do anything as shitty as this. All of which leads me on to my next subject. So while I'm browsing YouTube, I'm watching this video. Top upcoming science fiction movies of 2021. It's a whole bunch of trailers for new science fiction movies that are coming out in 2021. And while I'm watching the video, in between the multitude of ad breaks, I couldn't help but notice that a lot of these movies coming out in 2021, I'd seen these trailers before, in 2019, when I was watching a video called The Top Upcoming Science Fiction Movies of 2020. Which probably really shouldn't be too surprising because, well, 2020 happened. So a fair few of these trailers I have seen before. Movies like Ghostbusters 3, Black Widow, even though those are kind of stretching the definition of a science fiction movie to its breaking point, but hey, you know, movie studios have to earn money the same as everybody else. But there were still a bunch of new trailers for movies that I hadn't heard of. The thing that attracted me to watching this video in the first place was the thumbnail, because I took a look at the thumbnail and the title, Best Upcoming Science Fiction Movies of 2021, and I just burst out laughing, because on first glance it looked like one of the Sharknado movies was going to be included in this trailer lineup. Please tell me you've heard of the Sharknado movies. I don't expect you to have actually watched any of them because they're trash, but tell me you've at least heard of them. The Sharknado movies are exactly what you expect you're going to get when you combine movie stars, and I use that in the broadest possible sense of the word, like David Hasselhoff, in a movie about a tornado of flying sharks. Yeah? Yeah. So the idea that this type of movie was being touted as one of the best upcoming science fiction movies of 2021 was something that I found absolutely hilarious, and a fairly sad indictment of the state of the movie industry as a whole. But it wasn't a Sharknado movie. It was in fact a movie called Sky Sharks. Flying Nazi sharks attack the world. Yes, really. It may still be a fairly sad indictment of the state of the movie industry that trash like this is included in a list of the best movies to look forward to, but damn, I'm going to watch that. Guaranteed. Giant flying missile launcher equipped Nazi cybernetic sharks. You bet your ass I'm going to watch that. Anyway. Speaking of stuff that I've been watching, hands up everybody who's been watching and enjoying The Expanse on Amazon Prime. Yeah? I think I can quite safely say that I honestly think The Expanse is the best TV show available at the moment. And I say that having watched Season 2 of The Mandalorian, which I absolutely loved. Aside from the realistic and scientific way that it handles space travel and space combat, you've also got a ton of strong female characters. And none of these female characters are the Mary Sues that we often see in other works of fiction. Characters who can just do anything because often they're actually quite weak And they show their strength through adversity, by overcoming the obstacles set in front of them in realistic ways, instead of just, being able to do anything because. And they're not contrasted against weak male characters either. Male characters who just do and say stupid things in order to make the female characters look better. I'm just saying here, Disney, Marvel Studios, you might want to pay attention and start taking notes. But anyway, I watched the final episode of the current season, and something happened that I definitely don't remember happening in any of the books, all of which I've read, and which are just as good, if not better than the TV show. And that's saying something. And I'm not talking here about... I get it. When you're adapting the written word for the screen, you have to make changes here and there. Usually. Sometimes. Because not everything written down on a page translates well to a different medium. I get that. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the death of a major character who definitely did not die at this stage in the books. Now, it's going to be real difficult for me to continue on from here without at least some kind of spoiler. So if you have not yet seen the final episode of The Expanse, I definitely recommend you stop watching this episode of Mingles with Jingles right now. Thank you very much for watching this far. I hope you all have a great day. Okay. Alex Camal dies. Alex Camal, played by the Canadian actor Kaz, the Martian pilot of the Rocinante, dies of a stroke while undergoing a high-G burn in the Razorback. This did not happen in the books, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out why they would do it. And then I went on the Twitter. Oh my god. It turns out that Kaz, the actor, has been accused of multiple incidents of misconduct. He hasn't been found guilty of anything. Nobody's taken him to court. But a bunch of people have stepped up and said that he did it. And his character has been killed off. And he's been fired. He's been fired because nobody has proven that he's done anything wrong. And I'm really starting to get sick of this sort of thing. I'm not saying don't investigate. Absolutely investigate. If there's any hint of misconduct, it should be taken seriously. But you're supposed to prove people are guilty before you punish them. I'm fairly sure that's the way the justice system is meant to work. Except it doesn't really work like that anymore, does it? Now it's trial by social media. I'm not saying he's innocent. Actually, no. I am saying he's innocent. An innocent man has had his career destroyed because a bunch of people said that he might have done something. But how can you say he's innocent, Jingles? There's plenty of evidence to indicate that he may very well be guilty. Well, I suspect, given the nature and number and how far back these allegations go, that before too long we'll probably find out that he is guilty. But at the moment he hasn't been charged with anything, and he certainly hasn't been found guilty of anything. Until such time as that happens, he is an innocent man, but his career has been ruined anyway. What happened to burden of proof? Why has it become perfectly acceptable for anybody's career, reputation and life to be destroyed based on what somebody said they might have done? Anyway, in an effort to end this episode of Mingles with Jingles on slightly less of a bum note, I want to talk about something that I read recently. Because it was written by one of my subscribers who goes by the pen name of Anthony Richards, sent me the manuscript for his latest book, Nemesis. And it's not the kind of book that I would normally read. It's a crime thriller. It's the story of a member of the London Metropolitan Police VIP protection squad who takes the law into his own hands. Like I said, not the sort of thing I would normally read. I read a lot of science fiction, some fantasy, although not as much as I used to, and I read a lot of historical non-fiction. Crime thrillers? Not so much. But once I started reading this one, I really couldn't put it down. It was way better than I had any right to expect it to be, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And hopefully you guys will too, because it's available on Amazon Kindle on the 4th of March. He's actually got a publishing deal for it. This isn't one of those guys who self-publishes on Kindle, most of which are absolutely terrible. He's actually got a publishing deal, and the hard copy of the book will be published sometime after that. But that's the 4th of March when the Kindle version of Nemesis by Anthony Richards becomes available for purchase. I cannot recommend it enough. It's a fantastic read. And of course he's one of my subscribers, so I'm more than happy to help promote it here in Mingles with Jingles. Anthony, thank you very much for letting me have a look at it before publication. And he's already started work on the follow-up, and Anthony, yes, I do want to read that one too. Anyway, that is it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've all had a great weekend, and as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.